Okay, I show it's 1:30. I guess maybe a few more people wandering in. Does everybody have the materials? This is when you wave at me or thumbs up or whatever that was sent to you that's on the thing, the right to terminate form and the 5-page handout and a couple other pages. Do you guys have the material?
Yes.
Is that a yes, Bob?
Yes, Bob.
Yes, Bob. Thank you, Tiffany.
Yes, Bob.
Yes, thank you, Danielle. That's good. And you have it, James? Do you have it?
Yes.
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 Okay. Good. Good. So, and of course, the Zoom is done great because it lets people do these classes from all kinds of different places or whatever, and we don't have to all, get into the office and the training room and catch the virus and die and all that. So it's a good thing, but it's a challenge because I miss that physical interaction. I mean, I miss that. Maybe that's too strong a phrase to use, but I just miss that energy that we have in a class. But this works out good, and you need to be patient with me as I go through the challenge of, sometimes I'll ask for questions and comments or whatever, and I'll have to be patient as I give you time to unmute yourself and work through the process. So in some ways this goes faster, but I find myself really having to be careful to take it slow and take my time to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to ask questions, give comments, and hopefully, we've got the chat function where you can put things in there. Julia, I presume are you here, Julia? I didn't know if she was.
I'm here.
Okay, so you probably can keep an eye on the chat and see if there's something that pops up that we ought to address or deal with or say, okay, good, okay, good. So as I mentioned in the email that I sent out to you, we try to touch on and deal with the current things that are happening. And Christy, our team leader this morning, we were in a meeting, and we both are busier than we've ever been. And I don't have a real good explanation for it, but on top of all the other normal things we've got going, we're incredibly busy and things keep coming up, things keep happening, and it's one of the things in this advanced class, I want us to be able to address those things because it will help us all learn from the experiences that each of us has. And this first form that we're going to talk about, the addendum for the buyer to terminate based on the lender's appraisal, we've had a number of situations recently where this has come into play. In some cases, our agent was the listing agent. In some cases, our agent was the buyer's agent. And there are a lot of questions. And one of the things that we kind of discovered is that this form tends to be a little misunderstood. In fact, I got a call this morning from a top agent in my other office, the Rockwall office, and he was asking about it. He says, I got to tell you, I don't have any idea how to use this. So we had a conversation, and I told him that I would send him my 5-page handout so he could read that, and then we could talk. And that's an important thing to recognize. One of the things I talk about in my handout, towards the end of this 5-page handout, I talk about that you need to understand this addendum, not only to appropriately use it for your buyer or seller, because it can come from both directions, but you need to understand it so that when you're in a transaction and the agent on the other side sends in an offer with this addendum, or a listing agent on a property you've got to buyer says, well, my seller wants us to use this, your understanding of this is really important to know how this affects your client, whether you want to use it or not want to use it. If you're a listing agent and you get an offer for this addendum, you need to understand what the choices that are made in this addendum mean to your seller client. And so hopefully, as we go through this, and we'll take our time and really touch on the main points of it, and you've got that 5-page handout that you can take your time and reference and look through it. But it's going to be really valuable for you to understand the primary concepts of using this addendum. Now, the first key point of this addendum, it's entirely voluntary. There is no requirement that this has to be used. If you've got the buyer, you don't have to use this addendum automatically. You don't say, well, our buyer's concerned about it, so we have to use it. No, you don't. Just like on the listing side, you may receive an offer with this addendum, your seller doesn't have to accept it. So it's totally voluntary. And both sides need to understand the purpose of this addendum, what it really does, and what it does not do as we work through this. So one, totally voluntary. Second, it can only be used in a transaction with conventional financing. Cannot be used on a cash transaction, cannot be used in an FHA or VA transaction. Only conventional. So if you've got the seller and you receive an offer with this addendum and the offer is an FHA financing, can't use this addendum. You have to explain that to the other side and say, I'm sorry, not allowed. Because the FHA VA rules require certain rights of the buyer, and the buyer can't give these rights up in this addendum. And it says so on the addendum, not for use for FHA VA transaction. So you need to understand the limitation of what kind of transaction this addendum can be used for. And by the way, as we're going through this, and I get to a point and you say, whoa, slow down, Bob. Say that one more time. Please let me know as we work through it, because from the questions I've gotten over the last several weeks, as we've been involved in this, it's clear to me there's some confusion on what the choices are on this addendum and how to fill it out and what it means to your client, seller, or buyer when certain things are done. Now, the other important thing, this addendum only deals with the opinion of value in an appraisal. It does not address any other lender underwriting requirements. Those are addressed in paragraph 2B, property approval of the third-party financing addendum. And you have that addendum in your packet. This only addresses the opinion of value issue in an appraisal. That's all that's addressed on this entire addendum. So any other rights of a buyer to terminate anything else involved with the property being approved is somewhere else, not on this addendum. So we need to be clear the limitations of all this is and all that's actually addressing. Now, this addendum can come from two different directions. The reason for having this addendum in transaction can be from a buyer who is in potentially a multiple offer situation, and the buyer wants to improve their offer. I talked to someone just a little bit earlier, and they were in a multiple offer, and they wanted to improve their buyer's offer to make it almost equivalent to cash. That the financing wasn't a big issue. What they really wanted is to make sure the seller didn't see the appraisal. So in that particular case, this addendum would be initiated by a buyer. A buyer would include this in their offer. And by the way, if there's going to be an addendum in a transaction that your client wants to have in the contract, it needs to be included in the original offer. It needs to be completed by your client, needs to be signed off, it needs to be checked off in paragraph 22 of the contract, which is where we list all the addenda. So that needs to be done with the original offer. And so when the buyer is wanting to initiate this, and the buyer looks at this, essentially the first two boxes are what a buyer is going to make use of in improving their offer. And by the way, these three choices are mutually exclusive. can only choose one. And it actually says that at the top of this thing. So check one box only. The lawyers on the Berkeley Lawyer Committee always like to put that in because they say, you know, we need to explain that to those salespeople because they're not all that bright. So we need to let them know we can only check all one box. And that's just sometimes kind of their attitude. But anyway, so it's mutually exclusive. Now, the first two choices deal with a buyer giving up some of their rights to terminate based on the opinion of value and an appraisal. And remember, that's all we're talking about. The appraisal, the opinion of value and appraisal, not anything else. Not property condition, not title, not any lender required repairs, nothing else, just the opinion of value. That's all we're talking about. So when the buyer checks off either the first box or the second box, the buyer is saying to the seller, okay, I want to address a possible appraisal issue. Now, if the buyer wants to make their offer really look as good as, say, a cash offer, then they could check off the first box. The first box is a total waiver. It's the buyer saying, I don't care how much the appraisal gap is, I'll cover it. Now, what an appraisal gap is that difference between the appraised value and the sales price, so that if the appraised value comes in below the sales price, we have a gap. And in the handout, I give you an example. So if you've got a $400,000 sales price and the appraisal comes in at $390,000, that's a $10,000 appraisal gap. So in the first box, when the first box is checked off, the buyer is saying to the seller, I don't care how big the appraisal gap is. And the agent I was talking to this morning was using as an example with his buyer, they were offering $30,000 above the list price. And they said, we're willing to cover $30,000, a difference in the appraisal versus the sales price. So in that example, the buyer says, we're going to make this equivalent to a cash deal. It doesn't matter how big the gap is. We'll cover it and we'll go ahead and close at the sales price in the contract. Now, if the buyer does that, there's some really important points that you need to be concerned with as a listing agent. One, if you get an offer and the first box is checked off, on the one hand, say, wow, that's good. Appraisal's not a problem because they're going to cover any gap in there. And on one level, that's kind of good, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's where you say, yeah, Bob, it is good. That's a good thing. But as a listing agent, what would your concern be when the buyer says this to the seller? Wouldn't you kind of want to know, can the buyer do that? Does the buyer have the money? If they have enough reserves to cover that 5, 10, 20, 30,000, whatever the gap may be. This is almost like the same proof of funds we do in a cash transaction or a large down payment. If you've got the seller and a buyer submits an offer with a first box check, as the listing agent, you need to talk to the buyer's lender and you need to say, hey, can they cover it? Do they have enough money to cover 5, 10, 20, 30,000, whatever it might be? And you'll have, as the listing agent, you'll have a good sense with your CMA how much of an issue the appraised value may or may not be. No guarantees there because we never really know, but you'll be in a pretty good situation. So when the first box is checked, while that's good, the listing agent needs to do some additional work to make sure that's a good choice. Now, I don't know, I don't see her on this call, but we had an example of one of our really fine agents who has a seller in a multiple offer, and the seller was not as concerned with the highest price offered, but the seller is more concerned with which one of these is more likely to close. that's a smart seller. That's the kind of seller you'd want to have. Somebody says, you know what? It doesn't matter how big the sales price is. If it doesn't close, it doesn't matter. So we need to make sure that can be taken care of as you work through it. So from the listing side, when you see those really good numbers, they see the first box checked off, you need to make sure that that in fact can be done. If you represent the buyer and your buyer is going to check off the first box, you need to make sure your buyer understands what that really means, how much they're willing to cover, and if they don't cover it, they're going to be in default, could lose their earnest money. And you probably need to have a conversation with that buyer or your buyer client's lender and say, you know, are they good with this? Can they do this? So the first box checked off is a huge waiver, a complete waiver on the opinion of value on the appraisal. Any questions on that before we get to the second one, which causes some little bit of confusion? Is where I pause to give you an opportunity to unmute yourself and ask questions. Okay, so does this mean that you're ready for the second choice?
Hey, Bob, this is Doug.
Yes, your question. Yes?
This still does not close up the chance for the buyer to renegotiate if the appraisal should fall short, correct?
Correct. It does not, the buyer is not saying, if in the first waiver, they don't get to renegotiate. In the first waiver, they're totally giving up all rights. Now, having said that, you have to remember that the buyer and the seller in a transaction are in total control. At any time prior to closing, either side can say to the other side, you know what, I know this is what we agreed to, but I'd like for us to reconsider this. They can do that at any time. But if the appraisal comes in less than the sales price and the first box is checked off, buyer has no ability to try to renegotiate with the seller on a different price. Doesn't mean he can't ask, but the seller says, no, we trusted you. You checked off the first box. You promised you were going to close at the sales price agreed to in the contract, regardless of the appraisal. So the buyer would have no leverage to be able to renegotiate under the first choice. Does that kind of answer that? We good with that?
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Okay. Now, the second choice, and it cleverly says partial waiver, which would cause you to believe we're not doing a complete total waiver like we did in the first one. We're doing kind of a waiver, a little bit of a waiver, partial waiver. And what it means is the buyer is saying to the seller, I want to give you, the seller, a little assurance that if there's a little bit of an appraisal gap here, we're willing to make up the difference. We're willing to cover it, but only up to a certain amount. And so the buyer may say to the seller, you know, I agree to pay you $400,000 for your property, and that's the sales price in 3C of the contract. And then the buyer says, and if there's an appraisal gap, I'll cover up to $5,000. Now, if that's what the buyer is going to offer, they would check off this second box. And you've got a blank in the second box in the double I for a dollar amount. And the dollar amount that would go in there for the buyer is they would take whatever gap they're willing to cover. And in my example, $5,000. They would subtract that from the sales price of $400,000. So in that example, in the second choice, the buyer would put $395,000 in that box, in that blank. What it means is if it appraises for $395,000 or more, but still less than the sales price, the buyer will cover the difference. So if it appraises for $396,000, buyer's going to come up with $4,000 difference to close the deal. But if it appraises for $394,000, this gets into Douglas's conversation. The buyer says, okay, it did not appraise for the number in the second choice. I was only willing to cover up to $5,000. It appraised for $394,000. Buyer can say, I'm not going to buy the house. I'm going to get out of the deal. I get my earnest money back. And he has that right, and it says so in the addendum. Or the buyer could renegotiate with the seller and say, you know what? I still want the house. I like the house. I'm still willing to cover $5,000 gap. So it says, okay, I tell you what I'll do. I'll drop the sales price by 1,000. And so what the seller would do is the seller would drop the sales price by 1,000, which would be $399. The buyer would cover 5,000 above the appraised value, which is $394, and still close the deal at the changed sales price. So in the TREC promulgated amendment, item number 1 on the amendment, you'd change the loan amount, cash down, and the sales price to the $394. So they renegotiate, keeping in mind that the buyer can say, nope, didn't appraise, I'm out of here. And they can get out of the deal because it did not appraise for the number in the box in the second choice. We good with that part so far? Questions on that? Because this is the choice that we get the most questions, and the typical question I'll get for this box, okay, buyer's willing to cover $10,000 or $5,000, $12,000, $3,000, $672. I said, whatever the number is, subtract that from the sales price in the contract, and whatever you have as a result is what goes in this blank. And if it appraises for that or more, buyer covers the gap. If it appraises for less than that, it's a whole new ball game, and the buyer can get out of the deal, get their money back, or the buyer and seller can renegotiate. And that's what allows them to do that. Questions on that? We're good with that so far? Hard to imagine we don't have a question on this, because this is where we get a lot of questions. But I have in the handout example at 2 different amounts to cover and what you would do, what the number is you would put in the second choice. Question? We good? Now, the third choice is an entirely different animal. The first 2 choices involve the buyer waiving some of their rights regarding the opinion of value and the appraisal. They'll waive some rights in choice 1, choice 2. Choice 1, totally waived. Choice 2, partially waived. Choice 3, the buyer is creating additional rights of termination, not giving up some rights, but creating additional rights of termination. If the buyer checks off the third box, on one level, it really doesn't affect the seller at all, but if you have the listing and you get an offer and the third box is checked off, you want to ask the listing agent, why is the buyer doing this? Because what happens in this third choice is the buyer is telling the seller and the buyer's lender, if it doesn't appraise for the amount that I put in this box here in a little I, then I can terminate the contract regardless of what my lender does, regardless of anything. I get terminated contract. I don't care if a seller drops the sales price. It doesn't matter what they do. If it doesn't appraise for this amount or more, I get out of the deal and get most money back. It's a very strong additional right of termination for the buyer. Now, the 2 scenarios that I see this used most often, the buyer is putting a very large down payment. Let's say it's a $400,000 sales price, and the buyer is putting $200,000 down. So he's only borrowing $200,000. The property appraises for $390, less than the sales price. And the sales price of $400,000 is what the buyer would have put in that blank when he checks off the third box, where you have a dollar amount in there. So the property appraised for less than the sales price, which gives the buyer a right to terminate the contract. Now, what happens with you by using this addendum, the buyer's lender, in my example, $400,000 sales price, $200,000 down, $200,000 loan, appraised for $390. Remember, when the lender has an appraisal done, they're asking the question, does the property have sufficient value to act as collateral for the loan? Now, think about that. $200,000 loan, $390,000 appraised value. Is the value of the property sufficient to act as collateral for a $200,000 loan? Absolutely. Lender says, we'll do that deal all day long. And the buyer says, no, you won't. I don't want to do that deal. I don't want to pay $400,000 for a property that the appraiser says it's only worth $390. I get to terminate the contract, and the buyer does because of this addendum. This addendum gives the buyer that right to terminate the contract, regardless of what the lender chooses to do. And we have this happen. We've had a number of transactions in which there was a large down payment and didn't appraise the sales price, and the buyer just didn't want to do the deal. Now, the buyer and the seller can, this example I just gave you, can certainly renegotiate. In fact, typically, when the buyer says, price for $390, I'm not going to pay $400,000. That's just not right. I'm going to terminate. What the buyer really wants is to negotiate with the seller to a new price, and say the seller says, you know what, the price is $390. Because I used this addendum, I get to terminate and get my money back. But seller, if you'll work with me on this, maybe we can come up with some compromise or something. You can drop the sales price to $390, or we can agree on a new sales price and, you know, cut the difference or whatever and do it. It creates a new negotiation timeline between the buyer and the seller. Question on this so far? Because there's more to this that we're going to talk about, but we good? Okay, you're doing a good job staying away. As you've got some of these pictures where it's not actually you, I can't really tell that you're in the background dozing off. I can't tell, Jen, that you're really dozing off there, so it's okay. It's all right.
I'm
So,
wide awake, Bob.
good. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Because I'm awake, and so if I'm awake, everybody should be awake. I mean, it's just how it is. Now, some things we should recognize in this third choice. We've got some blanks. The first set of blanks deals with the number of days from the effective date, and it deals with the appraisal. What the buyer agrees to do if they're going to terminate under this particular choice on this addendum, in order to terminate, the property has to appraise for less than the number that goes in the next big blank, and the buyer has to give the seller a copy of the appraisal. So if the buyer puts 20 days in the first blank, in that first paragraph, and then the buyer is going to terminate under this provision, he better have that appraisal done within that 20 days so he can give a copy to the seller. Now, remember, the lender is not a party to the contract. Nothing in the contract can make the lender do something within a certain time frame. So if you've got the buyer and they're using this, then you need to make sure you've talked to the buyer's lender, and the buyer's lender understands the timeline here and can do the appraisal within the time frame agreed to. Because in some areas, certain price ranges, appraisers are really busy, and sometimes it's hard to get this done in a good time frame. But this does create a timeline if the buyer is going to terminate under this provision. The second thing in the big blank in I here, that will almost certainly be the sales price. I've never seen it be anything other than the sales price. I don't know why you wouldn't have the sales price. If the buyer's doing this, they're saying, if it doesn't appraise the sales price, I don't want to do the deal. I can get out of it if I want to. So I can't think of any reason to have anything other than the sales price in this third choice. Because the buyer then is saying to the seller, hey, here's the deal. Didn't appraise, I've got $400,000 here. It appraised for $390. I don't have to do the deal. I don't care what the lender says. They're willing to do this loan all day long, and I want out of the deal. Well, they get out of the deal because the buyer and seller agreed to this addendum, and they agreed to the third choice on this addendum. Everybody good with that so far? Now, if the buyer is going to terminate under this paragraph, you've got a timeline, you've got a dollar amount, and you've got a requirement for the buyer to give a copy of the appraisal to the seller. But that's only if the buyer is going to terminate under this paragraph. This does not. This is an additional right of termination, has no waiver involved. This does not in any way, shape, or form take away the buyer's contingency in paragraph 2B of the contract, which is property approval. And I'm sorry, in the third party finance addendum, which is property approval. if it doesn't appraise for the sales price and your timeline has passed, you're past the number of days for the appraisal, you didn't get the appraisal done, so the buyer can't use this addendum because he's past the timeline. He still has a right to use the property approval, paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum, provided he hasn't gone past that timeline. And remember, in the new language we have in property approval, if the buyer's going to terminate because of the lender's underwriting requirements, he has to do that before 3 days prior to closing, and they have to have something from the buyer's lender to give to the seller. The lender says, here's why we don't approve the property. So even in an appraisal issue, in our example of $400,000 sales price, $390,000 appraised value, but we're past the timeline in this third paragraph, but we're still, say, 6 or 7 days before closing. And the buyer's lender is not going to approve the property because of value. The buyer can terminate the contract under paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum and send something for the buyer's lender to the seller saying, here's why we don't approve the property. So this particular third paragraph, while it gives the buyer additional rights, the buyer may still have rights in paragraph 2B of the third-party financing addendum. Does that make semi-sense? This is where you say, Bob, that's so clear. In fact, that is so clear.
Yes.
I'm ready to teach the class. Tisha, are you ready to teach class on this? No. But does that make sense so far?
Yes, sir.
Okay, now, here's something I want us to be clear we understand about this addendum. And fortunately, you've got that 5-page handout that explains all the things I've just said and gives you some more information. Nothing in this addendum affects the seller and requires the seller to take anything less than the sales price. Now, the buyer may terminate, the deal may go away, but you can't say, seller, here's what you have to do. You've got to reduce the sales price and take this. No, nothing in here can require the seller to take anything less than sales price. This is totally addressing the buyer's rights of termination or the buyer having a limitation on their rights of termination in choices 1 or 2, and then additional rights in choice 3. But the seller needs to understand they can't be required to do anything just because the buyer used this addendum. So if you've got the seller and you receive an offer and the third box is checked off, we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier. If this third box is checked off and you're the listing agent, on the one hand, you say, okay, that's just an additional right, termination of the buyer. Doesn't cost the seller anything, doesn't really require anything. And that's true. But what you will want to do as a listing agent is you'll want to talk to the buyer's agent and say, okay, what's going on here? Why is your buyer using this third choice? I will tell you most of the time it's because the buyer and the buyer's agent has no clue about this addendum and when it should be used and when it should not be used. They really don't understand the purpose of these 3 choices, and they thought they were doing something for the buyer that they really aren't. And you'll find that's the case. And then you'll have to decide the degree to which this may or may not impact on your seller and going through the process, and then make a judgment call and give your seller the information on it. But as you receive an offer on the listing side and you see this addendum used, you need to make sure you understand it so you can advise your seller client. So on the one side, buyer initiated action. On the other side, a seller initiated action. You have a seller, and because you're a really good listing agent, you know that even if you haven't yet, that this will be a multiple offer situation. This is a hot piece of property. A lot of people are interested. And in fact, you may already have 5 offers. In a case like that, you'll have a conversation with your seller, and your seller may say, you know what, I know we're right on the cusp of how much this thing might appraise for. And if I take an offer, I want to make sure it's a good offer with a good buyer and close the deal. I don't want the appraisal to be an easy reason for the buyer to walk the deal. So the seller may say to you, the listing agent, is there some way we can get assurance from the buyer that they'll kind of cover appraisal gaps of a certain amount or just totally resolve the entire issue of appraisal? Is there some way we can do that? Well, your easy answer is, well, you know what? We just happen to have an addendum for that. It's exactly for that. That's just this great little Trek addendum does exactly that. So let's talk about the choices you, the seller, could ask the buyer to make on this addendum that would help you feel a little bit more comfortable with the appraisal issue. This is an addendum that the seller may say to a buyer's agent. In fact, you could use the Texas Realtor form. That's an invitation to submit a new offer the seller can send to buyers. So you can send it to all your buyers. And one thing you can see on there is the seller would more favorably look at the buyer's offer if they would include this addendum and name the addendum, and they would check off either the first box, totally waiving it, or check off the second box and waiving it and be willing to cover at least $10,000, $5,000, whatever in a gap. So the seller could say to a buyer's agent, to a buyer, here's an addendum that we'd want you to use to make this work. The seller would never say to a buyer, we want you to use this addendum and we want you to make sure you check off the third box. Would never be something that a seller would initiate. Be no reason for a seller to be concerned on any level with a buyer doing the third box. Buyer may do it, and seller says, okay, what does that mean? And we can talk about it, but you would never as a seller ask a buyer to use this addendum, check off third box. Be no reason to do that. Question on that?
Bob Sprang, DeLuca.
Oh, Brian, how are you, sir?
Doing well. Can you rephrase that one more time, just as how to present that to buyer's agents when you're in multiple offer situations?
Yeah, good question. So here's the concept. You've got a listing, and through a conversation you have with your seller, and you may even have brought it up, says, you know, great piece of property, got a lot of interest, and Mr. Seller, you know, we've got it listed at you know, $400,000, and we're probably going to end up with an offers above list price. You and I both know, we've had this conversation. There's some concern about how much it would appraise for. So we've got some appraisal concerns here. So in order for us to have a good contract that we think can close, we may want to find a way to say to a buyer, we want you to be able to cover an appraisal gap up to a certain amount or appraisal gap period. So the listing agent in the conversation with the buyer's agent, and by the way, a good buyer's agent will already understand this and know where you're coming from. Our challenge is, and I know all of you are seeing this, I've never seen us have as many uneducated agents on the other side as we have today. And I don't have a good reason for why that is the case, but we do. And it's a challenge. But if you've got a good agent on the buyer side, when you say, you know what, I know you've done a CMA on the property. I know that, and certainly my seller knows, but we all understand there's maybe a little bit of concern here on the appraisal issue. And so our seller, as they're looking at multiple offers, would like some assurance from your buyer that if there is an appraisal issue here, you're going to cover it. And we can do that. And you know, and in fact, you might bring it up, you say, you know, there's an addendum concerning right to terminate due under appraisal for the buyer that can be used. And in that addendum, you know, the buyer can make a choice and agree to cover any kind of appraisal gap or just appraisal gap up a certain amount. So our seller says, you know, we'd like to see your buyer address this issue, and using this addendum is a good way to do that. This way, you're helping the buyer's agent understand you're aware of this addendum, you know how it can be used. You're kind of giving them a little bit of a hint on how to use and why it could be used. That gives the buyer's agent good ammunition to explain it to the buyer. And by the way, all this is coming from the seller, not from you, the listing agent. You're not demanding things. You say, You know, we've had the conversation with the seller, and a good buyer's agent is already concerned with the appraisal. They already know, wow. In fact, when you bring this up to a good buyer's agent and say, you know what, Bob, you're right. We had already thought about this. So I'm glad you brought it up so I can talk to my buyer and we can decide which of these choices we're willing to make in an offer. Does that make sense, Brian?
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. You're very welcome. So as we go through this and we look at this, if it's a seller initiated action, here's your challenge. And I don't want on any level, and I don't want anybody to walk away from this class or this conversation saying that I am speaking poorly of our competition. I'm just being a realist. You recognize when you're in a transaction how knowledgeable the agent is on the other side of the transaction. And if they're not very knowledgeable about a number of the things that can be done in a transaction, you've got to do a little extra work to protect your client. Now, what you will want to avoid at all costs, don't slip into the lecture mode. Don't say, well, clearly you're pretty clueless. So let me explain to you how this works. Don't go there. Don't go down that road. But you have to be aware of their level of understanding, because and I'm throwing out a little bit of humor here, but sometimes you've got to use small words and talk slowly to really help them understand here's kind of what we're talking about here. A good agent, much less conversation because they already know what you're talking about. In fact, they probably were already thinking about including this in an offer anyway, because they want to make sure their offer looks good and they know appraisal might be an issue. So as you work through this, you want to make sure you can deal with that and go through the challenge. So do we see why, regardless of which side you're on, it's really important for you to understand how this addendum works? One, so you can advise your seller client, if we've got a situation that we're concerned with appraisal, here's something we might consider. And if your seller has a strong negotiating position, then you can recommend this to buyers agent. If you represent the buyer and you're in a multiple offer situation, you want to make your buyer's offer more attractive, you can advise your buyer on the parameters of this addendum and when and how it could be used and what should go in there. This is the wrong time, particularly if you're going to use a partial waiver, for you to say, there's a blank there for a dollar amount, and I think that's the sales price. I'm not sure. You want to cover $5,000 gap? Maybe we put $5,000 in there. See, not a good conversation. You want to know that whatever they're going to cover, you subtract that from the sales price, and whatever the result is, that's what goes here. If it appraises for that or more, buyer's covering their gap. So you need to understand what's going on there and kind of how that works as you deal with it. Does that make semi-sense? And especially as you're working with an agent on the other side, whether you've got the buyer or the seller, an agent on the other side who really doesn't understand this, if it's really valuable to your buyer and it can really improve your buyer's offer, you need to be prepared to explain it to a listing agent. Because if they don't understand it, they won't do a good job of explaining this to the seller and helping the seller understand how your buyer's offer is really a good offer and a much better offer than another buyer's offer because you've got this addendum and you've made proper use of it. Does that make semi-good sense? We're good with that? So I would encourage you to use the 5-page handout that really explains all of this and goes through the process and make sure that everybody does it. You'll want to be comfortable enough with this addendum, kind of like with Brian's question, how you present this to the other side. Be comfortable enough with this to see the benefits of it, how it can be a plus, how it can be an advantage to everybody as you work through it, so that you can understand when this can be a really valuable tool in the transaction. So before I move on to the next, any final questions on this? Is this an explanation that was respectful enough and slow enough and clear enough that it makes sense that you understand this addendum and when and how it can be used?
Absolutely.
Great. Okay. Now,
Bob,
I have a
question. Yes, Tish?
I have a question. So the addendum would be used together with the third-party financing, correct?
Yes, great question. In fact, I'm just getting ready to talk a little bit about the third-party financing. Great question.
Yes, Bob, okay,
So-
my understanding is the third-party financing has that protection, right? And you said you
Okay.
only use the addendum on a conventional, not a FHA or VA, correct? This
Yeah,
addendum-
can only use it on conventional. So let's talk about the conversation about what's in the third-party financing addendum and what's in this addendum we just talked about. So in the third-party finance addendum, conventional loan, so first box is checked off, A is checked off. We're not worried about buyer approval. We know what that is. We got a timeline for that. We go to the second page of the third-party finance addendum and we look at property approval. Now, in property approval, a buyer has certain rights, and one of the requirements in property approval is the property must meet the lender's underwriting requirements. Now, we don't know exactly what those are. We've got some examples here, things like value and lender required repairs and title and things like that, condition. But one of the things that is included is the value, the appraised value, opinion of value. That one right, that one condition of property approval can be waived by the buyer in a conventional transaction. None of the other underwriting requirements. We're only talking about the opinion of value. So, Tish, great question. You would use this addendum, the appraisal addendum, and it would not keep you from also using the third-party finance addendum, because you want to have paragraph A, which deals with buyer approval, and then paragraph B, you want to deal with all the other underwriting requirements. For example, an appraiser may go out and the property may appraise, but there may be lender required repairs. Well, that's an underwriting requirement. And when the buyer uses the addendum we just spent 45 minutes on, that only addresses opinion of value, doesn't address other underwriting requirements. So there may be other underwriting requirements that the buyer has protection in paragraph 2B, property approval, different than the opinion of value. And as long as the buyer, if they make use of property approval, if they're going to terminate under that provision, the buyer has to do that termination no later than the third day prior to closing. And they need to have something from the buyer's lender that they can give to the seller, something in writing where the buyer's lender says, this is why we don't approve the property. So Tish is exactly right. You still use the third-party financing addendum. You still have all those rights for lender underwriting requirements. All you're talking about in the addendum we just talked about is the opinion of value in an appraisal. That goes away if the buyer checks the first or the second box in the appraisal addendum. That right for the buyer to terminate based on the appraisal goes away. They lose that one specific right, but not any of the other lender's underwriting requirements. Those are still in place. Does that make sense? Are you making that distinction?
Yes, it makes clear, yes.
Okay.
One of them's appraisal and the other one has the protection of repairs in it, so.
Yep. So, and it could be title issues, could be property condition issues, could be any of those other things. All we're addressing this addendum is the opinion of value, not just the appraisal, but the opinion of value from an appraisal. Because an appraisal may have other things, other statements, other conditions, other things in there. The appraiser may make remarks about conditions that cause the lender to say, okay, we'll approve this loan, but it needs a new roof, or it needs foundation work, or it needs an AC work. There's some property condition issue that the lender requires, has nothing to do with the opinion of value. Does that make reasonable sense? We good with that?
Yes.
Okay. So you would never, there are no addenda, none. Trex got, I mean, they're actually, when you go to the Texas Realtor website and you pull up all the forms, there are actually 45 addenda and related forms that go transactions. TREC itself has 16 that are TREC promulgated addenda and plus 2 temporary residential leases. None of those addenda in any way, shape, or form precludes the use of another addendum. In fact, when you deal with the buyer's right to terminate based on appraisal, you automatically want to deal with the third-party finance addendum because the third-party finance addendum is referenced in the appraisal addendum. So you'd want to make sure you use both to work through that. So great question. You have to deal with both of those. You good with that before I go to the next little thing here we're going to deal with?
Well, I have another question.
Yes,
Would you-
ma'am.
If you're on the buyer side, would this addendum not cloud the offer because let's say you're high property and you put in an offer and you're putting this addendum with it? Do you think the seller might say, well, this is kind of clouding, and there's multiple offers, so would you?
Okay, good.
not buyer using it?
That's a great question. And we do want to be conscious. Anything we do in an offer that clouds the offer could work against our buyer. However, if the buyer makes an offer and they use this addendum and they check off the first box, that doesn't cloud the offer. The buyer is saying to the seller, you can go to sleep at night and rest comfortably knowing that the opinion of value from an appraisal will not be an issue. We will close this deal. We'll come up with the additional money. We'll make this thing work. We've got the money to do it. We'll cover any gap that happens. That's an assurance. That's a plus from the buyer to the seller. So I think when you do something, you check off the first box, I don't think that clouds it. I think that's a benefit from the buyer to the seller, that if, as a buyer's agent, if you communicate that and make sure the listing agent understands it, I think you're not going to see this as clouding the offer. You're going to see this as improving your buyer's offer.
How about
Because the listing agent may have already been concerned about the appraisal issue anyway. Go ahead.
well, I know. How about number 3? Would number 3 is the one that I'm more
I
concerned?
think number 3 would cloud the offer, because what the listing agent's going to have to do as a minimum is say to the buyer's agent, why are you using this and why are you checking off number 3? Now, an easy answer from the buyer's agent may be, well, because he's putting 50% down. If it doesn't appraise, he wants to be able to get out of the deal. That's a reasonable reason. Seller may say, well, whoa, no, I don't want this to happen. I don't want this problem. I've got a buyer already thinking about not being committed and being able to get out of the deal. So using this addendum and checking off the third box could well cloud the offer, because a listing agent and the seller may say, why are they doing this? What's going on? So I would agree with that using third choice and this addendum could in fact cloud the offer. So,
Hey, Bob, Doug,
yeah.
I got a quick follow-up question on the addendum with the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. I know the option 3, we don't want to cloud that up too much, but I know the first blank allows us to put in days. The second blank, is that the sales price or the appraised value?
Yeah, it's a sales price.
Dollar amount that they'd be willing.
The dollar amount for a double I and for I in the third choice there will always be the sales price.
Sales price, okay.
Yeah.
So follow-up question on third-party financing addendum. Paragraph 4, VA required provision. That blank, is that the sales price or dollar value that they would willing?
Well, that is a sales price, but keep in mind, you won't be using this addendum if it's an FHA transaction.
That's true.
Yeah, but if you're doing an FHA transaction, not using this addendum, and in paragraph 4, second page, third-party finance addendum, what goes in there is the sales price.
Yes, when you're using VA and FHA.
Yeah, FHA and VA, you want to put the sales price there. Good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. You're welcome. Other follow-ups on this? Ready to go to the new MLS NAR rules that went into effect May 1st of this year?
Sure.
Okay, good job. When the change was made May 1st, and this is the big thing that was emphasized, is the transparency rule, that once you publicly market a property, which by the way includes just having a sign in the yard or put it in Facebook or anything like that, then the listing agent has to within 1 day put it in MLS. And that's kind of what we emphasize. And so we had a lot of conversations about what does it mean publicly marketed and what kind of flexibility we have, and if we have to put it in within 1 day, Can we put it in and coming soon, which is the typical thing you would do. So we had a lot of conversation on that. Somehow we slipped past, and you've got a form in there that gives you some information out of the NETRIS rules, MLS rules, that they changed the rules on coming soon. Well, they changed the timeline. It used to be 14 days. It's now 30 days. But they have something in here that you see emphasized there that really was the rule before. It's just no one really paid any attention to it, and it was not enforced. But during this coming soon timeline, there can be no showings. The property cannot be available for showings. If something happens and a great buyer shows up and a buyer wants to see it and sells it, wow, man, that's a great buyer. I want them to be able to see the house. I want to do this. You can do that, but then you have to immediately change the status to active. And if one person sees it, then you've got to let everybody see it. But if you're during the coming soon status, there can be no showings during that time frame. No showings. Now, the 30 days is not an absolute requirement. You don't have to wait 30 days. If the reason you got it in coming soon is the seller has to do some things to it, and then 2 weeks later he's ready to put it active, not a problem. You don't have to wait 30 days. But if you don't do something, it's in the 30 days. If you haven't taken it to active, it will automatically go to TOM, temporary off market. So what you want to do is stay on top of that timeline in there and make sure that that's done within that time frame. We good with that? Because the thing that somehow we didn't really make sure everybody had a good sense of is what could and cannot be done during the coming soon time frame. Because frankly, back in the old days, back before May 1st, when coming soon was 14 days, we were showing properties. It was happening all over the place. And evidently some complaints have been filed. And now we've discovered that during that timeline, we can't be showing it. If we do show it, we've got to take it active in MLS. Questions on that? Okay, I want to talk about something that is a hard thing to do. It's a challenge. Well, one of our challenges is we're all good agents, and as you've said in my classes and heard me talk about it, there's a trait that we all have that sometimes gets us into trouble. Anybody remember what that might be? Let me help you. Oh, wait, that's what it is. You're helpful. You want to be helpful. Because one of the things we want is we want our client to feel good about us. We want to be helpful. We want to be a resource. They're using us because we're a resource. We have expertise. We know the market. We know how to negotiate transactions. We know how to write offers. We know how to go through the process. However, we have limitations. And we've had some transactions recently that really point out our limitations, and we've got to find a way to more effectively communicate that to our client without our client feeling like we've abandoned them or we're just not going to help them or can't do it. And two basic areas that we can talk about, one, the title commitment, and the other, the survey. One of the things that as agents, we cannot do, and TREC is specific about it. TREC doesn't allow us. We can't take a title commitment and give our opinion about that title commitment. That's a legal opinion. You can't do that. However, we do want you to look at the title commitment, especially in Schedule C. If you look at that and something pops up and you go, whoa, what's that? What's that IRS lien for $100,000? We hadn't talked about that. So perusing it, but not looking at it and giving an absolute opinion, especially looking at the big worded commitment, not just the schedule, the 4 schedules of the commitment, actually 5 basic D&E. but you can't interpret it. You can't go through that process. Same thing with a survey. You don't have the authority, you don't have the ability to look at a survey and give your opinion about encroachments, about overlapping protrusions, about challenges with the survey. You don't have the ability under your real estate license to read a survey and interpret it and talk to people. Now, it's certainly acceptable to look at it. And if you look at a survey and you see that it's inaccurate, for example, it's got the wrong address on there, wrong legal description. It shows a 50-foot wide lot and you were clear it was 100-foot wide. If it's some obvious, or for example, your buyer's already talking about building a pool in the backyard. And when you look at that survey, you say, wow, it appears to me there's some easements here. I'm not a surveyor, so I'm not going to interpret and talk to you about easements, but there's something there. And what you're going to tell your client, your buyer in that example, you need to talk to the title company. You need to talk to a surveyor. You need to get a professional's opinion about the impact of what's on this survey. And if there's an encroachment, if there's a problem here that can impact on you, so you can object to it and not close, not understanding what's going on here. Because the title company, if there's a challenge in the survey, such as an exception, such as an encroachment that they'll take exception to title policy, they're not required to tell the buyer about this, frankly, unless they're asked. The only thing the title company is really covering in a survey are mistakes on a survey or things that are not known at the time of the survey or at the time of the closing. So you've got to say to your buyer, if you've got any questions about this, you talk to an expert. Ask a title company. Good title company will talk to you about it or talk to your buyer about it. Talk to a surveyor, find out what's going on here, because your buyer didn't listen to you and they accepted a existing survey. Hopefully they amended it. Same thing, a title commitment. You need to encourage your buyer to have an attorney review a title commitment. Could be a title company attorney. Ask good questions about it so they've got a better understanding. You can't be the one that interprets a title commitment for your buyer. You don't have that authority. If a complaint's filed, TREC will say, it looks to us like you've just practiced law, unauthorized practice of law, and they could take action against your license and our license. And I don't want to explain to Mike Brody that he's got a TREC complaint coming because you were overly helpful. And I don't think you want me to have to do that either. So we've got some limitations here, but these limitations, and one of the things that as you look at all your scripts and you look at all the things you talk to your clients about, you have to be able to do it in a very positive, supportive manner so they feel good about what you can do for them, but they also understand what you can't do for them. Because what we hear and I've heard this in the last couple of weeks from unhappy clients, they say, whoa, Bob, we trusted your agent to tell us all that. Well, there were things that our agent didn't have the authority to tell the client. And the challenge is the client didn't really know that. Now, on one of them, they knew it. They just were trying to ignore it. They didn't want to take their own responsibility for what they knew. And that's sometimes a challenge. But we want to be helpful, but not overstep our authority under our license. We don't want to make statements about conditions of the property, things like that, because then we become responsible for those conditions of the property. So you want to have to be really careful on our limitations as we work through it. Questions on that? And frankly, there should be, because we're all involved in different levels at doing those things.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
So if there is a question or something questionable, for example, say they want to build a pool, and I don't know how to read a survey, or whoever doesn't know how to read a survey, is it fair to have the title company attorney answer that question?
Yes, it could be. Here's the thing, Danielle, if you have a buyer and they've already had the conversation with you about want to build a pool in the backyard, you'll make sure in paragraph 6D under objections, they put that in the big blank.
Okay.
This creates a right of termination. Your advice to your client is to make sure the contract gives them that right to do things. And if something happens, such as in a survey or the commitment that creates problems, then they're now aware of it, and they can have an objection, and they can object to it and have a conversation with the title company attorney and so forth. but
Okay.
your job is going to be to make sure they've included those things in the contract.
And what if you don't because it is a multiple offer situation and you're trying to look attractive to the buyer, the seller?
Okay, here's
You tell the
this is a
client
this is a
too.
great segue. This is a great segue into my last point. When you have a situation in which your buyer's in a multiple offer, and I think we're going to see more and more multiple offers. In fact, we might need to look at having a more extensive multiple offer class. And so your buyer's in there, and you're looking for ways to avoid clouding an offer. And you know that if you put in that big blank that buyer wants to build a big Olympic-sized pool in the backyard, and none of the other offers that the seller is considering say that, this may cloud the offer. So before this problem happens, you need to be having a conversation with your buyer and say to your buyer, says, okay, here's something that's important. Here's a way that you can put something in the contract to protect yourself so you can object if you're not able to do certain things. You'll explain to them in paragraph 6D that there are limitations on what they can object to if they don't put something in a big blank. But you explain to them also, if you put something, even something that's important to you, the buyer, in the big blank, it may cloud the offer to the point that seller accepts somebody has offered. So buyer, you've got to accept how much risk are you willing to take. Now, there are ways to deal with this. You're going to have an option period. You may have mandatory HOA. You may have other rights of termination. So during that process, you can advise your buyer, says, okay, let's make our primary objective right now for you to get into a contract, for you to get the seller to accept your offer. And then let's move very quickly during the option period to do the research and see if there are any easements or problems or anything in the way of you building a pool. And while you don't have rights of objection under 6D, you have a right to renegotiate the contract or to terminate the contract because of the option period or mandatory HOA or something else. You could then say, here's how, buyer, we can deal with that risk, because what we're doing is we're saying, what's really important now, let's get into a contract.
Mhm.
And then we'll deal with these issues during the contract time frame in certain rights of termination that you'd have. So you need to watch that. And if you've got a buyer going into a cash transaction, no mandatory HOA, no other rights of termination, your buyer's taking a lot of risk. They just need to be aware of it and make a risk-based decision. Because here's the concept. Before a problem happens, you need to already be discussing it. You can't wait till the last minute, say, wow, we've just now discovered we're in a multiple offer situation. We know you want to build a pool, and we could put that in paragraph 6D, but here's what it might do to you. And here it is, Saturday afternoon, and the listing agent already says, you know what? You guys have a 7 o'clock decision going to be made, so you need to get an offer in here. You need to do it right away. That's a tough time for you to just then have the conversation. You should have a sense of the type of property your buyer is looking for. It's going to be competition and how to solve some of these challenges before you get to that point. It's just like the concept of having to deal with in multiple offers, creating contingency or something in special provisions, maybe require attorney language. And here it is on a Saturday afternoon. You go, well, how am I going to create this language? I can't get a hold of an attorney. Well, you need to work that out before Saturday hits. You've already found yourself dealing with that before the fact. Does that make sense, Danielle?
Completely, yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it was a tricky situation because that was when properties were flying off the market before they even hit. And, but anyway, they were cool with it and he understood.
Yeah.
I feel, is there anything else I can do?
Well, and the
One thing I
key,
didn't do is
yeah,
check-
and the key in a situation like that is for you to note the other things in a transaction. And in our area, most of the properties are in mandatory HOA anyway.
Mhm.
And so you've got rights there for your buyer to have some control and renegotiate and have a right to terminate if they need to at least protect their earnest money. They've got the other cost of transaction. But that way you can advise your client, okay, let's make our primary objective here, get you into a contract. But we've got enough rights in this contract, given the type of property we're dealing with, that you're protected in other ways. We just have to move forward in a very timely manner.
So speaking of the HOA, can we advise on that? Because I remember there was nothing in the HOA that would prohibit it.
Okay, that's a great question. It's a little bit like the survey and the commitment question. You cannot, as an agent, take that HOA, all those subdivision information, the documents, including the resale certificate. And we talk about resale certificate a little differently,
Mhm.
and review that and advise your client. Can't do it. It's a legal opinion. And some of those docs are 30 pages. And you're going through all that and giving a can't do that. You need to encourage your buyer to read it, to call the HOA. If there are any possibilities of anything that may get in the way of what the buyer wants to do, your buyer needs to talk to somebody at HOA before closing, before the time frame ends. Because in your HOA, if it's a mandatory HOA, your buyer has from day one of the contract until they receive the docs, 3 days after that, or closing, whichever comes first. They've got all that timeline to terminate and to do all that. So when you get that information, you want to make sure your buyer understands their responsibility to take a look at that. And the big thing is, if they've got any questions, rather than read through this, I understand this, where does it say I'm prohibited or not prohibited? Says, no, I'm sorry, I really can't advise you. The HOA docs are not promulgated forms. The resale certificate is. We're going to talk about that in a second. You need to say, if you've got any questions about what you can and cannot do, such as you want to use this as a rent property, here's the HOA, contact people. You need to talk to them and see what you can and cannot do. You need to have that conversation. Now, let's talk a little bit about the resale certificate, because that is a promulgated form. Texas Real Estate Commission has a promulgated form that's a resale certificate. You don't need to be an expert on it. You do need to be able to look at it and make sure it is completed and see if anything jumps out at you. And the things you're going to look at it jump out at you, dealing with lawsuits, dealing with reserves, dealing with claims, dealing with things in there that say, wow, that's kind of interesting. Encouraging your buyer to have a conversation with someone at the HOA, preferably somebody who filled out the HOA, who filled out the form, and have the conversation so they feel comfortable about what they're getting into. Your biggest challenge is going to be when you're in a very new development, and maybe it's a development where the developer has just now turned over the HOA to property owners, because the developers will require a certain number of owner occupants before they'll transfer that to the homeowners. And in that first year, you may have a severely reduced dues and fees that aren't anywhere close to what it's going to be after that first year. And it's a great risk for a buyer on a brand new development, unless it's a major developer or a major builder. The smaller the project is, the smaller group is, the greater risk it is. Danielle?
Yeah.
Look, I had a question, follow up.
No, that's real good. I got it. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Well, we do need to stay on top of that. And our big thing is, we need for the buyer to feel like they're on a team with us and we're working together for their interest. And that while we have some limitations, there's no limitation on the advice we're going to give them, encouraging them to say, I can't tell you what this means, but here's who you need to talk to find out. Here's where you need to go for that. Here's how you need to work through that process to help them be able to understand how all that works. They need to feel like you're really supporting them. You're being their advocate and working through that process. You'll be able to do that. Does that make semi-good sense?
Absolutely does. Thank you so much.
So working through that and dealing with that. That covers most of what I have been experiencing fairly recently with this addendum and our limitations and working through it. I will say to you, we had a leadership meeting this morning. Mike and Christy and Angie, they couldn't be there, but and we are constantly amazed at how you are just doing incredible. How hard you're working in the middle of all this, how you're doing the right things, you're being careful, you're being safe, you're working through everything. Our June, in comparison to June of last year, is ahead of last year. In fact, we may well have a record June in number of units sold. I mean, we're doing great because you're doing great. You're doing amazing things out there. And we're quickly moving into a high demand situation, and as things are shifting in certain price ranges, certain neighborhoods, buyers are being incredibly aggressive. But because they're being aggressive, we're seeing multiple offers, and we're seeing sellers understand how that works and and getting some really good deals and things getting sold. I mean, we just have one in an area where I live, one of the highest prices of any property in our subdivision, sold in one day. And it just, but it was a great piece of property, been updated and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, we're seeing that type of thing happen. And so you need to be really prepared as an agent on either side you're on to know what's going on and to really properly advise your client, because the opportunities there are great. And one of the things that we're finding with all this stuff going on, people have become more aware of how important having a home is, having a place to be. We're all experiencing that, working through it. And they're also understanding the value of a really good agent. Our value proposition has really become incredibly important. And we're able to do things at levels that maybe weren't as apparent a year ago, but are incredibly apparent now as you work through this. We're just finding people going, wow, cannot imagine going through this without a top agent like you. And it's incredible. Now, there's a flip side to that. The flip side of that is you better be really good. You really need to pay attention. You really need to know what's going on in the market. You really need to prepare to work even harder for your clients, because that demand is there. And it's a real challenge as you work through it. Any questions on that as you work through it? I'm so happy to be in business with you. You guys are doing incredible. You're doing great. Any questions other than what we just talked about that you said, yeah, I was hoping Bob would touch on this. Anything you've got? Because we all learn from each other's experiences as you work through it. Tisha, what's your coworker's name? She's got a coworker there with her.
We just call him Kitty.
He's what?
We just call him Kitty Kitty.
Kitty Kitty? Okay.
Yeah.
How's Kitty Kitty doing?
He's doing great. He's in the middle of my business all the time.
Yep, that's how they are. I'm working at home, which is driving me nuts, by the way. This has caused me to go into therapy. But my coworker, i.e. my boss, my wife, does a great job of being patient with me and let me work through all these things and being able to deal with it. But it's I cannot tell you how much I miss that live interaction that we have, and eventually we'll get back to it. But I appreciate everybody being patient with me, learning through all the Zoom stuff and getting all that done. So any follow-up questions for just anything else you've been dealing with or that you've had that you might want to have to talk about and say, wow, let's deal with this. What are we going to do about this, Bob? Anything? This is your shot to the big time. You can do it.
I tell you, we appreciate you so much, Bob. Thank you as always.
Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. It's great to be in the middle of a group like this. And I just, I can't imagine doing this business without being involved with people like we've got at KW Plano. I mean, it's just, I find myself feeling sorry, not real sad, but I just can't imagine people in other market centers who don't have what we have. Of course, they just may not know any better. If they've never been exposed to who we are and what we do, they'd say, they just never didn't know better. But it's just so great.
Well, you have such a wealth of knowledge. It's just absolutely amazing that, and very comforting that you're there to support us, to keep us out of trouble.
Well, and I would thank you for that. And I would encourage you, make sure that you have the hotline and you make use of the hotline, because we've got those 4 great agents on the hotline that you can call, so that if something happens and I'm not available or Chrissy's not available, then you can do that. Be sure and call that number on they're available all during the day until 9 o'clock at night and on the weekends. So when you have questions and when it gets to something where if the question is something that rises to a different level, they'll be very quick to say, okay, let's get Bob involved. Let's get Chrissy involved, whatever. And every once in a while, they'll say, let's get Mike involved. And I said, no. That's why Mike hired us. Let's don't bother Mike. Let's kind of keep going through that. But thank everybody so very much for everything you do. And if you don't have any last questions, I'm ready to move on. I'm through. I don't see Julia here. I don't know if she can shut us off or whatever, but I guess everybody can just check off where they have to leave. But thank you guys very much, and I appreciate it, and go out and have a good, safe day.
Thank you, Bob. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you. There's Julia. Okay, we're through.
Oh, you're good? Okay.
We're good.
Awesome.
Thank you, Julia. So we're done.
Bye.
We're gonna leave. Thank you very much.